Okay. Hmm. Well, welcome. This is the working uh, preparatory stuff for next week's Wednesday office hour. Um, there may be one or two more of these things available, and they will feature, of course, the usual issues. So we're looking at chapter 4 in Fujio Mizuoka work on Marxist geography and subsumption. The point, of course, of doing this, as I've said before, is to find the current sort of work that covers uh, not only geography but Marxist geography, and of course the issue is uh, how do these things sort of connect? And his explanation, he hasn't even gotten to subsumption really. He's sort of tried to define space. So we're up to chapter 4. And this is the outline for chapter 4, properties of relative space and its dialectics, the annihilation of space, which is really a key element in Marx. This idea that, you know, time and other things annihilate space. And spatial annihilation is an interesting problem in and of itself. The real subsumption of space by eliminating space itself, agglomeration. So the real subsumption of space by eliminating space itself. And then 4.4, spatial integration and network, and 4.5, conclusion. This chapter involves the dialectics of the relative space in parallel to the absolute space in chapter 3. Pristine relative space separates substances by distance. Remember, we're talking about decay, right? And has dividing and individualizing properties. Those in power in society exploit these properties in executing power to promote discrimination and segregation in society. The divided space, thus, functions in contradiction to egalitarianism and fraternity. The distance property of relative space needs to be annihilated through agglomeration and spatial integration. There's a lot there. Constructing the network to transport and communicate. So there's a distance property that exists with distance decay, right, in relative space, and it gets annihilated or needs to be annihilated through agglomeration and spatial integration, constructing the network to transport and communicate. So there's a paradox. I think you can already see there's a paradox in that the network becomes sparser rather than more dense or intense, and the spatial configuration becomes more uneven as transportation travels at higher speeds. So we haven't really talked about the commodity form in this context, but the distance decay becomes less of an issue um, because you have something that sort of transcends or exists at a level above that, and it's a function of things like agglomeration and spatial integration. So on the one hand, you have more efficient networks. On the other hand, space is becoming annihilated at the same time. All right, so let's see if we can get to this. Properties of relative space and its dialectics. A. Introduction. The relative attribute of pristine space has properties that contrast with those of absolute space, specifically in terms of the relative spatial relations of objects with two fundamental properties, that is, identification of the individual positions and isolation with distance between the positions. So these are locational issues, right? So you're sort of saying, okay, well, here's stuff, here's people, or whatever, and they are relatively differentiated in space. In other words, relative space works for individualization and distantiation Now, because of these properties, relative space functions as a discrete, segregating, and discriminatory division in society. So you can already see, particularly in context of last chapter, we're talking about boundaries and porosity and stuff like that. You can see that this is just simply another element of that. Society and the economy are substantiated and work properly only when every member is interconnected through communication and transactions. Now, once formally subsumed, relative space also functions both positively and negatively for society and the economy. Positively, relative space provides society with the spatial designator, spatial designator for the interaction of people and economic transactions. All right. So relative space has something that within which things are designated. The interaction is, described in that sense. Persons cannot conduct social or economic interactions without determining a unique spatial point. So this idea of spatial points is important. One shouldn't misidentify it with, for example, data points or whatever, but there is some resemblance. Negatively, distance blocks such interaction. So there's, on the one hand, there are things that are indicated in space, but the distance becomes problematic in relation to it. The distance decay effect limits the spatial expanse of social and economic activities, making interaction difficult. So we've described distance decay, but we're not sort of talked enough about how it works. Hindered by distance, agencies are fragmented and isolated from one another in society, or the economy is pushed to the verge of collapse. Relative space is therefore more amenable to such concepts as differentiation, isolation, and sometimes discrimination. So, there's a difference between differentiating something, isolating something, and then discriminating, choosing, one thing over the other in society. The distance decay effect also affects political and social relations as one moves from the core of control to the periphery. Remember core periphery relations, we've talked about that before. The power from the center weakens in inverse proportion to the square of distance. We've already heard that before, right? Inverse proportion to the square of distance. Whereas the social forces opposing this control may strengthen relatively on the periphery. So this is, if you want to talk about how colonialism gets overthrown or whatever, it is, in fact, on these bases that, for example, in South America, revolutionary or oppositional forces take advantage of this inverse relationship of core to periphery, and the relative weakness of it is why Shining Path lasted as long as it did, Tupac Amaru in Peru. B, relative space as a means of identifying positions. That's every point on the Cartesian surface. Remember, we were talking about Cartesian stuff in reference to geography and the geometry. Sorry, two chapters ago. Is uniquely defined as every point on the Cartesian surface is uniquely defined. Relative space provides the function of spatial differentiation and identification. So we're talking about, we could call it functionality, but it also helps us get at a kind of real relations. Anyway, this attribute contributes to the social property of relative space, which is the identification of the positions of things. Remember, we talked a little bit about this, about, that it is a kind of situating in that sense. Anyway, we'll go back to that. It is essential for society to identify the location of market trade and to establish social context among the members of a group. Every object and subject and various relations among them, as well as the mutual actions generated, are given spatial uniqueness and individuality. Economic and social processes are established and accomplished only with this property of relative space. For example, the market economy forms a global abstract space mediated by money, which is universal and impersonal. I mean, that's what a market economy is. It's a global abstract space mediated by money. And I think you shouldn't have any disagreement with that. That's kind of how things work. Yet individual transactions are carried out by independent economic agencies, with every transaction being always unique. It's why paper money has serial numbers, right? Trade in goods takes place at discrete locations agreed by both parties. Therefore, in the global market space, a distinct location must be identified. It's how you get your stuff from Amazon. Both parties, the sellers and the buyers, must agree in advance exactly where and when to trade the goods. The daily purchase behavior of convenience goods by consumers and the purchase of the means of production by producers occur through a tacit agreement on the position or place at which to trade goods. The position or place at which to trade goods. For social interaction to take place, a specific position and time to act must be agreed between the parties involved in the activity. So this is a coordination problem, right? For example, they make a promise with their friends saying 5 p.m. at XX, whatever railway station, south exit. It's the only reason, it's the only way in which we find each other, although obviously we can have different mechanisms to do that. Sometimes the multi-layered system of territories is used to indicate uniqueness. For example, at 4XX station, there is an implicit knowledge among the persons concerned about the relative position between the railway line on which the XX station is located and the city center. Location can also be identified by a nested system of administrative divisions designated with the places, street names, and house numbers. That's how the grid operates in a city, yeah? And particularly if you have centralized transportation hubs, etc. A system of relative space for the individualization of economic and social actions is essential for the representation of abstract metrical space. Abstract metrical space. The SAC from 86, right? Yet it has been created by the political power. For example, the abstract and geometrical designation of the land of the New World had the clear purpose of conceptually and then actually clearing the land for Indians. The geometric lines of territorial authority become sweeping space clearing and maintaining devices for territoriality, instituting communities. This is sort of a function of rights of way and railroads and etc. And subjugation and reservations and whatever, the use of the military, etc. The passing of the prime median through the Greenwich Observatory in the outskirts of London, the British capital, symbolizes the former global hegemony of the British Empire. The Greenwich time being, kind of this ultimate centralized deal. Yes? The relationship between economy and society gives economic and social meaning to individual positions and their names. So a place name becomes important. For example, a place name such as Beverly Hills came to represent a high-class residential area, and a street called Champs-Élysées eventually imply that the shops there are of a higher class. It's sort of the joke about the difference between Rodeo Drive and Rodeo Drive. Sometimes people don't get that joke or whatever. C, distance. Marx explained the concepts of distance in their most pristine form as follows. A dimension of space, it is a certain length which may as well express the distance of two other things besides those compared. So in other words, space is defined, at least from a surface point of view, by 3 points, right? So the distance of two other things besides those compared. In speaking of the distance of two things, we speak of their difference in space. Thus, we suppose both of them to be contained in space, to be points of space. So 2 points, but they're not one-dimensional. They are, in fact, two-dimensional, at least. So they are, relativized in that sense. So suppose both of them are contained in space to be points of space. Thus, we equalize them as being both existences of space, and only after having them equalized subspecies spati, we distinguish them as different points of space. To belong to space is their unity, and this is important relative to theories of surplus value, part 3. Between two different positions, there exists a distance, an attribute of relative space. Reciprocal acts are to be carried out over distances. And Marx talks about this. Interaction over the distance connecting two positions rapidly decreases in line with the gravity model of the law of gravity in physics. In this model, the amount of reciprocity F between the two positions is, and you can see this here, Fij equals MJ over dQij times dot K. So what does all this mean? This formula indicates that the amount of traffic and communication between I and J is proportional to the product M, which is the masses of the point of origin and destination, for example, the population at each position, and inversely proportional to the Q power, usually Q square equals square 2, I don't know, of distance. Oh, okay. That kind of gets us at that inverse squared relation. Anyway, of distance d as in dog between the two positions Q and K. Q and K are parameters defined by factors such as the technical nature of the means of transport and the intensity of the propensity to travel. As distance increases, the economic and social interaction between I and J rapidly weakens. This is called the distance decay effect. So at this moment, we now actually have an equation that helps us describe distance decay. Much like in the prior chapter, we could have talked about central place theory as being mathematical, etc., but we didn't. The degree of the distance decay effect varies according to several factors. First, the amount of information distributed per unit production cost, the amount of information distributed per unit production cost increases. The amount of information increases as the negotiation, transaction, and technical information become more complicated. And even if it is the same distance, it incurs a higher cost. Thus, overcoming the distance determined by the modes of transportation also changes the extent of the distance decay effect. And I think this is Alan Scott's description of this idea. The most primitive way of overcoming distance is direct physical interaction, such as personal face-to-face contact or voice communication. It is why we privilege, phone contact. This leads to agglomeration, which is discussed in section 3 of this chapter. D, position and distance used to distinguish and discriminate. All positions in relative space are separated by distance and individualized. Therefore, distance, this idea of something at a distance or distance, leads to spatial differentiation. As mentioned in the previous chapter, Buchanan tells us that goods traded need to be divisible. Goods traded need to be divisible. With distance between the masses, each good is individualized one to another. The distance that individualizes the goods traded is the fundamental spatial condition for the market economy. That seems uncontroversial, right? I mean, what is a market but, kind of disposition in space in that sense? In a hierarchical social group, relative space is positively subsumed. Relative space is positively subsumed by those in power to distinguish and discriminate those governed. In the old Japanese family system, for example, the order of seats in the main family meeting room was determined by expressing the rank of the members in the family using the position of the fireplace as the nodal point. And this happens in a lot of cultures. There's certain symmetry arguments. There are ways of defining the component parts and et cetera, and they have relative positioning in that sense. In the urban segregation of North America, richer social groups prefer suburban settlements to distance themselves from poor social groups living in the inner city for sake of proximity to jobs. So you can see how distance is created to create status of some kind, right? I mean, and we've probably all grown up in that sense. That is, if we grew up in a suburb, we have certain relationship to the city, and those of us who grew up in cities certainly have a certain position on those folks from the suburbs who live in the suburbs. And yes, they're complex, and they can be as simple as spatial envy. It's quite possible. It's better in one sense to have, for example, scouting. That is, sort of childhood paramilitary organizations probably work a little better. I mean, if they were actually having to do paramilitary stuff, it would favor the city. But the reality is, in terms of developing it, it it needs more space. Whatever. Anyway, the inner city is further spatially divided into those in poverty and specific ethnic settlements. And you can sort of see that in the history, right? Ghettos, Chinatowns, whatever. Such individualization of the living environment affects the real estate market, needless to say. Part E, place. Thus, the positions of relative space have their own contextualized meanings and economic and social connotations. These are connotations, not denotations, right? They offer a common understanding among the market members of the spatial position where the market transaction is to be carried out and demonstrate a common understanding of the position of the mutual actions of the social group. So, in terms of history, we can talk about the rise of market society that is also seasonal in that particular sense. And this is why, ultimately you get road networks, villages become towns, towns become cities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The position that has thus become socially meaningful in this repeated action is called a place. Places are defined by the occurrences of activities. That may be oversimplifying it, but that's what Sachs calls it. Places are defined by the occurrences of activity. So it is something that occurs. It's iterated in that sense. Place can thus be defined as a spatial position containing social or economic meaning given through repeated, as I just said with iteration, repeated actions. It is different from the common use of the word, such as the parking lot is full and there is no place to park my car. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of things embedded in that which are different and can actually be made more complicated, and we try not to do that. The concept of place is similar to the concept of territory, which we looked at in the last chapter, in that the attribute of pristine space comes to have the meaning of economic and social relation. However, the territory is the outcome of the negative subsumption of the contiguity of absolute space, while place is the outcome of the positive subsumption of the position of relative space. So we're looking at contiguities. The negative of the negative subsumption is associated with the contiguity of absolute space, while place is a different way in which we can talk about things, is the outcome of positive subsumption as opposed to negative consumption of the position of relative space as opposed to absolute space. So there's a lot there. Therefore, place is different from territory in that it does not necessarily assume the concept of spatial expanse. So that's a kind of constraining condition in there, or parameterization, whatever. Repeated occurrences spontaneously give the place a name, which is the designator of a particular place and carries meaning. A place name sometimes manifests the history of the place and is placed in the social value spectrum ranging from prestige to stigma. So there's certain meaningfulness in certain things, some of which have to do with, lexical differences, that some places are, may imply certain other things by their names. F, the relation between absolute and relative spaces. In determining the boundary and ensuring the exclusivity of territory, each point of the boundary must have a different positional identification. For the bounding of absolute space to be successful, each point of the boundary, remember we talked about boundaries in the last chapter, needs to have a personal property, that is a positional property. Each point of the boundary needs to have a positional property, which is a property of relative space. Thus, the territory, a product of the subsumption of absolute space, simultaneously contains the attributes of relative space. Each position of relative space with individuality is therefore a causal element of the individuality of a territory. So, you're arguing from the idea is that there is a set of relations, abstract to relative, and there is a certain causality, or this is that difference we were looking at in the last chapter about the difference between a kind of formal idea about subsumption and a real subsumption. As discussed earlier, the infinite extent of pristine absolute space ultimately converts to the organization of the collective absolute spaces, which is defined as the aggregate of the fragments of the mosaic of this region. Through the production process of this configuration of space, the homogeneity, ubiquity, and isotropic nature of absolute space comes to possess the attribute of relative space. On the other hand, spatial movements across space require portions of absolute space as a right of way. You need a shitload of dimes, whatever. The movement of peoples, goods, and ideas requires society to set aside roads and the like for transportation and to disallow other activities from taking place. on them. This is still more Sack from 1986. Relative space also determines the inherent range that a social entity possesses in performing its action, which defines the size of the action space. Remember, that's what we looked at in the last chapter. Yet, as discussed in the previous chapter, political power can sometimes set a boundary to the freedom of movement. For example, using an international border control post beyond which labor cannot move. Unless you think that that's unimportant, that's the whole kind of oppression that, Israel has over the Palestinians relative to Gaza or whatever the occupied territories. Anyway, 4.2, annihilation of space. In keeping physical distance, social relations can be isolated and divided, leading to their collapse. The proverb, out of sight, out of mind, expresses this ingeniously. The property of distance thus supports segregation and discrimination, or in short, division, as in social division, division in society. To transcend the contradiction between this property and society, the distance among the social entities must be overcome. That is, this negative effect must be negated by society with produced space through production of physical means of transportation and communication. So that's sort of the difference. There's a negative effect from having people separated from one another, but that becomes less problematic, moot even, with the advent of transportation. So, self-driving cars are a kind of example of that. They, as they run around, they annihilate space as well. Alrighty. So, we shall move further. 4.2. This is a process of the real subsumption of relative space. It is carried out through the deployment of technology and investment in transportation and communication. So, real subsumption of relative space is connected, not simply functionally, but in perhaps a real way, through the deployment of technology and investment in transportation and communication. Section A, annihilation of space by time. The attempt of capitalism to subsume pristine relative space in real terms through the application of science and technology, investment in new forms of social organization is summarized in Marx's famous phrase, the annihilation of space by time. Now, the process of commodity realization, that is C prime dash M prime, normally takes place at a point spatially different from the location of the labor process. It doesn't all happen in the same place. Space is the arena in which the private ownership of the means of production is connected with the social nature of the production activity. In this sense, space becomes involved in the capital circulation only after commodities are ejected from the privately owned labor process. By this stage, the direct process of interaction between humans and nature, from which humans produce a commodity with use value and capitalists exploit surplus value, is already over. So this whole set of things are over in that sense. It's sort of a phase on, we looked at differences among circulation as described by people like David Harvey. Although the commodity ejected into space no longer creates fresh surplus value, the reduction of circulation time appears to the eyes of capitalists to be the original source of surplus value. So there's a kind of a differential view of this activity. This creates an incentive for capitalists to efficiently subsume space in a real manner, in this case, to annihilate space. You could argue that urbanization is a kind of example of that, thereby giving an entire discipline sort of things to do. But it's a lot more complicated than that. In the capitalist economy, even if capitalists attempt to annihilate space by the most efficient available means, they cannot do so without the people and activities which, given social demands, spread across space. And though it necessitates the means to annihilate, even though it necessitates the means to annihilate space. So this is paradoxical in that sense. This is a contradiction inherent in the subsumption of space by capitalism. So even though stuff's spread out, we're sort of obliged, or we have some sense of wanting to annihilate it, or that it annihilates itself, or however you want to, whatever. This is a contradiction inherent in the subsumption of space by capitalism, of which capitalists are superficially aware. To their eyes, space is a stumbling block delaying the time when the commodity is actually sold. Distance in terms of decay distance in markets. One that necessitates an additional expense, that is, transport cost and cost for maintaining the continuity of production. The aim of capital is to engage in competition to subsume space in the real manner, or to annihilate space in that sense, is therefore to minimize the effect of this stumbling block, thus connecting the labor process with realization processes in spatial terms as directly as possible. Marx calls this process annihilation of space by time. He states, quote, the more production comes to rest on exchange value, hence on exchange, the more important do the physical conditions of exchange, the means of communication and transport, become. Capital, by its nature, drives beyond every spatial barrier. Capital, by its nature, drives beyond every spatial barrier. Thus, the creation of the physical condition of exchange, of the means of communication and transport, the annihilation of space by time, becomes an extraordinary necessity for it. And this is from the Grundrisse. As such, space is the envelope of time. Distance constitutes an important element of the use value of space in the property market. The distance from the purchaser's dwelling place to other places, to centers of commerce, work, leisure, culture, or decision. Time, therefore, determines the use value of space. This is Lefebvre. Time, therefore, determines the use value of space. Nevertheless, the above arguments of Marx suggest that the topic of the annihilation of space should be treated in a wider context. Space related to the circulation process of capital is a stumbling block for capitalism. Time is the one means of annihilating this stumbling block, but as the discussion of this chapter reveals, those means are not exhausted by time alone. For example, Marx himself discusses another means of annihilating the effect of space in chapter 15 of Capital Volume 2. That is, the continuity of production through spatial agglomeration. Hence, we use the more general term, that is, the annihilation of space, rather than Marx's own more restrictive phrase, the annihilation of space by time. The annihilation of space is one attempt by capitalists to transcend the contradiction inherent in private production as a part of the social division of labor. Though capitalists compete most harshly against one another using every available option, the privately owned labor process and social demand are always separated by pristine space, a physical existence which can never be annihilated altogether. the annihilation of space does not therefore mean disappearance of the physical space. Thus, the annihilation of space is the everlasting, yet never accomplishable imperative of capitalism. We imagine that we could have little tech cities and, it doesn't have black folks or whatever in it, etc. That is from the white point of view. Thus, the annihilation of space is the everlasting yet never accomplishable imperative of capitalism. Capitalists are continuing, and will continue their endless competition against one another to annihilate space, imagining that their private production is instantaneously realized as part of the social divisions of labor. There's a lot packed in that. B, annihilation of space and acceleration of capital turnover. And we've discussed this before, that it is not simply, annihilating space or leveling certain resources, etc., but also the idea that capital turnover is one of the other kind of mechanisms, as it were, of this activity. Under a given technology, transportation vehicles travel at a certain speed with a certain capacity across space. The potential limit of annihilating absolute space is therefore subject to the time required to connect two different points separated by a certain distance, and the volume of commodities or number of people that can be transported at one time. Thus, the attempt to annihilate space is manifested in the transport and communication technologies of a given period. For this reason, society tries hard to stretch this limit in space subsumption by improving transportation and communication. The capitalists with more efficient means of annihilating space end up with more surplus value. They can earn extra surplus value if their efficiency is above the average. The competition for ever more efficient ways to subsume and annihilate space originates from the inter-capitalist rivalry for a larger amount of extra surplus value. The picture of this competition is similar to that for more innovative technology. If the options available for capitalists to annihilate space are finite, however, the competition for more efficient means to subsume space ends up with a equilibrated spatial configuration of capitalism. In a capitalist economy, the higher the velocity of the turnover of capital, the more frequently the same labor process can be repeated. Hence, the more surplus value can be exploited. So, there's a productivity and growth criterion. Marx states, quote, the more rapid the circulation, the shorter the circulation time, the more often can the same capital repeat the production process. Hence, in a specific cycle of turnovers of capital, the sum of value created by it had surplus value as well, for it posits necessary labor always merely as a labor necessity for surplus labor is directly proportional to the labor time and inversely proportional to the circulation time. This is from the Grundrisse. As circulation time grows with the distance of the market from the point of production, capitalism must attempt to reduce this by improving technology, especially in terms of the quote-unquote development of the means of communication. Marx points out the demise of old centers of production and the emergence of new ones with changes in the means of transport and communication, from Capital Volume 2. With this improvement, the turnover of capital accelerates and the commodity proceeds rapidly from one phase to another. It's from Theories of Surplus Value, Part 3. Thus, more surplus value can be exploited. The attempt of the real subsumption of space The attempt of the real subsumption of space by improvements in the means of communication and transportation is, therefore, one of the crucial imperatives of capitalism. Quote, a condition for production based on capital and promoted by it for that reason. This is Grundrisse still. In other words, the means of transportation and communication are the general conditions of the social process of production and large-scale industry on which the capitalist mode of production is based, necessitated a revolution in the means of transportation. This is from Capital Volume 1. Without this revolution, the attempt by capital to tear down every spatial barrier to intercourse, that is, to exchange, and conquer the whole earth for its market, also from the Grundrisse, is never possible. Only by improving the means of transportation and communication can capitalism annihilate space with time. Alternatively, the result is the same. Capitalism can reduce to a minimum the time spent in motion from one place to another. The means of transportation and communication with insufficient capacity, for example, those handed down from the period of manufacture, etc., become rapidly unfriendly, a combination sort of support unit. Anyway, the means of transportation and communication with insufficient capacity, for example, those handed down from the period of manufacture, immediately became unbearable fetters as soon as large-scale industry starts producing a large volume of commodities. So there's a kind of in-betweenness that I hope you can get a sense of, particularly, since they do have a fair amount in their air inventory before they become overwhelmed. But anyway, except those handed down from the period of manufacture immediately became unbearable fetters as soon as large-scale industry starts producing a large volume of commodities. For this reason, large-scale industry had to make these means for annihilating space adapt themselves to the mode of production by means of a system of river steamers, railways, ocean steamers, and telegraphs. It's still Capital Volume 1. The most common way of extending the limit of space annihilated and reducing the time allocated for the circulation process is raising the labor productivity of the transport industry by applying more innovative and efficient transportation and communication technologies. Thus, in periods of greater prosperity, capitalists put the same passion which increased production into the building of railways. This is Capital Volume 3. Additionally, an increased frequency of service of the means of transportation provides another way of reducing the circulation period overall. This type of improvement in the means of transportation does not accelerate the actual speed at which a commodity travels over space. However, reducing the size of circulation reservoirs at a warehouse and so on helps to accelerate the velocity of the turnover of capital. Successive quantities of goods can now start their journey at some more closely defined spaced intervals, and thus arrive on the market one after another without accumulating in great masses as potential commodity capital until they are actually dispatched. By this distribution of the reflux over several successive periods, the total circulation time is shortened, and hence also the turnover capital volume 2. To stretch the limit imposed by the use value of the commodity itself, capitalists continuously attempt to improve the means of transportation, not only in terms of its velocity, but also its quality. The invention of lorries or freight railway cars with refrigeration facilities, or those that absorb excessive shocks during transportation, all of that is, no wonder, is that's good. Nevertheless, to the extent that these technologies have a time limit to hold a commodity fresh, there is always a finite limit for capitalism in its attempt to annihilate space. When capitalists strive hard to annihilate space, the relative differences in pristine space refrain. Let me close that right there. So, I will stop the share and stop the live stream. Thank you very much for your attention. We will come up with another one to